Zachy Hassan is your host on this most epic journey through pop culture's past. Hold on to your butts. This is Nostalgia Theater.
Brought to you by the Movie Film Podcast.
Welcome back to Nostalgia Theater. This is Zachy, and you are listening to this show during the 80th anniversary of my all-time favorite comic book character. Now, some of you already know who that is, but those of you who don't, it is Superman. It's not Batman. I like Batman. It's not Spider-Man. I love Spider-Man. But Superman is always there at the very, very top, and everyone else is a mere piker when it comes to the Man of Steel. So here to discuss the anniversary of Superman with me is a guest who I have been wanting to have on since this show was first incepted. I don't know if that's a word, but it is now. I am talking about Mark Hughes, whose writing appears at Forbes. He does film criticism. He's also a screenwriter, and his love of superhero cinema is no secret to anyone who reads his writing and follows him on Twitter. So, Mark, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Oh, thank you for having me. I'm really glad to be here. This is a discussion that we absolutely have to have and need to have, and I'm glad to be here with you talking about it. This is great.
Well, so it is the 80th anniversary of Superman, but it's weird when you look at how all of these anniversaries do kind of line up when it comes to Superman, because 40 years after his creation, we had Superman the movie, which was obviously, it was kind of a big deal, a little bit of a big deal. And then for the 50th anniversary, we had the Superman animated series from Ruby Spears, and also the Superboy syndicated series, which I am a fan of, and I feel like I'm one of the few fans of. And then in 1993, we had Lois and Clark, the New Adventures of Superman, which is now turning 25. I guess before we sort of get into that, because I really want to get your take on what you think of all the different permutations and manifestations of Superman on screen, but talk to me about your own history with Superman.
Well, I love Superman. I've told this story many times that as a kid growing up in the rural South, and where we lived, there was, literally, it was a gravel road, and there was a swamp at the end of the road, and there were alligators in that swamp. So this is not a place where there was a lot of exposure to the better things in society and life at that time in the 70s. So comic books were a huge escape for me, comics and television and movies. And I learned to read from comic books. My older brothers would get comics from friends at school and would sometimes pick some up at the store. And I learned to read off Batman comics. Batman was my big, favorite hero and is my favorite. But Superman was right up there. It was always Batman, Spider-Man, Captain America, and Superman in that stage of my life. So I love Superman, and I actually, my brothers had these two old books that they got that collected. They were hardbound books. One was a Batman hardbound, one was Superman, and it collected some of the most popular stories from each decade of the character's history.
Yes, I had that book as well.
It's terrific, isn't it? So I love that. Now I have the collections of all of from the very first all the way through for Batman and Superman, right, for just all the years of them that they've put out. But back then, those books were my Bibles, and I loved Superman. And the early comics actually were the ones that spoke to me the most. The ones from the 30s and early 40s, when he was much more of a social justice. Yeah. I love those comics, and the whole idea of a hero who stood up for not just, we say the truth, justice, and the American way, but it was a set of ideals that really went beyond that and went to ideas of social justice, which some people treat as a dirty word. I don't. I think those are great words, and there's a reason that our heroes should stand up for them. So Superman represented those things to me. And then, of course, and we can talk about the movie, but when the first film came out, I was 8 years old, and it was unlike anything. I mean, I'd watched the old TV show, you know, the 1950s show. And the scenes of him, I remember, and I'm sure you do too, as a kid, the scenes of him flying in the air when he's just laying on something.
Yeah, right.
It doesn't look real at all. And when he's flying towards Earth, they would just tilt the image.
Right.
But as a kid, you know, it was like, he's flying. Look, he's flying. So when the first movie, the big movie came out, it was just, you know, completely rocked my world and blew my mind.
So you were the exact right age to watch the Richard Donner Superman movie.
Yes. Oh, yes.
You know,
definitely.
I mean, you had a bullseye on your head. It was like, this is our target audience.
Yes. Yeah. And I remember, as a matter of fact, when the trailers first came out for it, and, you know, back then there was, of course, no internet or anything, so we didn't have a lot of entertainment news unless you watched entertainment segments on the nightly news, and they didn't talk about it quite as much. And I got most of my movie information from Roger Ebert and from Siskel and Ebert and their various syndicated shows. Right. And I remember the first time that I saw Superman and that tagline, "You will believe a man can fly." And it's just, I mean, it made me want to cry as a kid that this is really happening. It just out of nowhere, you know, just boom, there it is. Oh my God, there's Superman, and he's really flying.
You know, it's funny. Just as an aside, I feel like it's a mark of a specific kind of geek when you say, I was a little kid and I would watch Siskel and Ebert. Like that to me, you know that even as a kid, this person is going to grow up and have something to do with film reviewing or film fandom, because not every kid did that. Like, that was me. You know, I'd be like, no, I can't go out. I got to watch Siskel and Ebert. And it's like, dude, you're in 7th grade. Where are you? You know? And it's sad. You know, by the way, it kills me that, like, you know, I teach film and media studies. My students today have no idea who Gene Siskel and Roger Ebert were.
That's just awful. Everybody has their favorites, but there's no question in my mind as far as the greatest all-time film critics, and for me, it's Roger Ebert.
Yeah, I'm with you. Well, with that in mind, I mean, and circling back to Superman, certainly that the film franchise, you entered into it at, like I said, exactly the right age. You're 8 years old, and you can just sort of let it wash over you. And granted, as kids, we tend to be probably a little more forgiving of things. I mean, when I was 8, so when I was the same age you were when you saw Superman, I watched Masters of the Universe in the theater.
Oh, wow.
And
yeah.
And God help me, I will go to my grave defending that movie, even though objectively it is not a good movie.
Sure, but it's a fun movie. It's entertaining.
It is fun, you know, and it's I showed it to my kids like while they're little, so you know, when they were like 6 and 7, because I wanted to like plant the seed in them now so that they will always have a little amount of affection for that film. But, you know, kind of the same thing. Like, my first theatrical experience ever was Superman 3. And
oh my goodness.
Yeah, and same drill. Like, I will defend that movie for what it means to me while fully acknowledging, well, I mean, it's not very good, you know.
But Reeves is always great. I mean, he never, no matter how bad the movies were, Superman 4, he is as earnest in that as he is in all of them. He takes it, never gives less than 100%.
And I would argue, actually, I think Christopher Reeve is, in Superman 3, he is the best he ever was in that role, in terms of the way he looked, the way his hair was styled, and just his level of absolute comfort playing that character. Because this was 3 movies in, he'd figured it out, you know, because Superman 1 and 2 were shot at the same time, and he was still kind of figuring it out. By the time we get to Superman 3, Christopher Reeve, not so much the movie wrapped around him, but Christopher Reeve is Superman, and I think that's a big part of the reason I do have such a soft spot. And I actually think the way he plays Clark Kent in the Smallville scenes where he's with Annette O'Toole, that's Christopher Reeve is the most comfortable just being that version of Clark, because he's never done that.
So how old were you when you saw Superman 3?
Let's see. It would have been either 84 or 85.
Yeah.
I was visiting my grandparents in India, actually, and it was playing in the theaters there. So we were like, "Yeah, let's go see it." And I still have I remember being terrified by the when Robert Vaughn's sister turns into like the computer lady.
Yes.
That's one of those things that I've seen like enough people online where that hit them at the right age where it scared the crap out of them.
Yeah.
So I'm not alone there. But I mean, it is an odd movie. I will never defend it qualitatively, but I think there's a lot to appreciate in it.
Yeah, it's not I don't think it's a great film, but I think Christopher Reeve, the whole thing with him going back to Smallville, and it was great. And I think, of course, the scenes where he's evil Superman fighting Clark, all of that stuff, and Superman pulling pranks, and that's all terrific stuff. And if you kind of, okay, yeah, well, it was, they just basically wrote Lex Luthor out and created an alternate version of Lex Luthor. But as goofy as the Richard Pryor stuff can be, if it wasn't for the slapstick elements of it, there's, I can imagine a version of that film that, lacking the goofier moments, would have been maybe not on par with the first two films, but certainly not
such
would have a better
drop.
Reputation. Yeah.
Yeah.
And there's, by the way, have you ever seen Superman Redeemed, the fan edit version, where they took parts of Superman 3 and parts of Superman 4, edited them together with deleted scenes from Superman 2, and created a whole new movie? And it's not great, but it's actually better than either Superman 3 or 4. It takes all the best elements of the Superman and Clark Kent character and creates a new story that is shockingly entertaining and gets closer to being a true, worthy sequel to the first two films.
Honestly, it's the first time I'm even hearing about it.
Yeah, I have it on. I have the DVD of it, so at some point we'll have to sit down and watch that, because I think you'd be amazed at how good it is. It's really hard to find now, but
you've piqued my curiosity. Yeah, you asked me how old I was when Superman 3 came out. Like I said, it was like 84, 85, so I was like 5 or 6. Because I saw it a little bit later. So to some extent, I was close to the age you were when you saw the first Superman. The difference for me is I was born in 79, so right between Superman 1 and Superman 2, so I was just soaking in it right from the cradle, basically, and my mom always says this, that when I was growing up I would call Superman na because that na
that's terrific.
Yeah, and she still tells me about that. I'm like, oh, na and for me, Christopher Reeve was just the real life realization of this character. Like, it never even occurred to me that he could be anybody else. I didn't become aware of the George Reeves show until probably the mid 80s at some point. Now you had seen the Reeves show before the film.
Yes, yeah, I was already when I was like 5 and 6 years old, so 75, 76, I was already seeing the original. I think that's around about 6 years old is when the original Batman was in syndication where I was, and I could see it. And the Superman show had been on for a lot longer. I don't even remember. I can remember that back among my earliest memories, seeing the old black and white and then the color versions of the old series, and all of those 60s cartoons too that they did, the Batman ones and the Superman ones that
the
were
Filmation ones.
Yeah, I really enjoyed them. I thought they were. I can go back and look at them now, even, and I'm like, look, animation quality doesn't hold up, but considering what it was, they were pretty faithful adaptations of what was happening in those comic books at that time.
At that time, yeah, absolutely. I think the Filmation, definitely the Superman one. I don't have as clear memories of the Batman show, but the Superman one, it looked like they took Wayne Boring's artwork or like Kurt Swan from the 60s and just animated it.
Yes, yeah. The same with the Batman show. It was in. I'm looking it up now to see the Adventures of Batman, and it started in '68. That's what I thought.
And then they used the same model sheets for like the '70s one, right? Like with because they brought back Adam West and Burt Ward, and that was I want to say that was like the late '70s.
Yes,
right?
that is exactly.
Right.
Now they had not been the original voices in the first iteration of that show in the 60s,
It was
but then
Casey
they were in
Kasem
the 70s.
Was Robin.
Yeah, it was so weird.
Yeah. And Casey Kasem was on Superman.
So right into it in the 70s. It was much more campy and goofy, whereas in the earlier, the 60s, it took itself. It played it pretty straight.
Right. Yeah, and that's interesting, right? Because to me, people point to Batman and sort of say, look at how elastic the character is. Look at how the character is able to withstand all these different interpretations. And the conventional wisdom is like, well, Superman is less elastic than Batman. And I chafe at that a little bit because I say, well, I mean, look at all the different ways this character's been interpreted. There's certain fundamentals that remain the same, but it still allows for taking into account, changing times. I mean, you're not going to confuse the George Reeves version with the Christopher Reeve version. They're two very different takes on, forget Superman, certainly Clark Kent, the way Clark Kent is played, and yet they're both equally valid.
Yeah, I completely agree. I've never, people that talk about Superman as a limited character, I kind of feel like, well, then you've probably had limited exposure to the character, or maybe just, and I don't mean to just say everyone who disagrees with my opinion is wrong, but usually they are. No, I think there's a certain tendency, particularly among fans, I believe, of anything, that if you're a fan of something, inherently you have strong feelings about it, and you probably kind of gravitate toward a particular incarnation or a particular approach, and being a fan, you're much more invested in that, and so you might tend to kind of take it more personally. So I think that's where a lot of that comes from, and that fans, there's a particular way they perceive something, and it's hard for them to see outside of that box. But as you said, it's the very fact that we're looking at the 40th anniversary of Superman the movie, and the anniversary of Lois and Clark, and the anniversary of the end of the original George Reeves run. That alone, those are all such different versions of the character. And then, of course, Smallville, and then even in the comics, I mean, Superman in the in the early days, he would kill the hell out of you if you were a war profiteer.
Right.
And he was overtly like, "Hey, these people are just making money off bombs. Quit war." And he was a very different character. And a lot of this goes to I think the distinctions between even the portrayal of Superman as there's literally there is Old Testament Superman and New Testament Superman. There's Superman as Moses and Superman as Jesus.
Right.
Originally, he was Moses. He was very much kind of the Moses character, and derived so much of the mythos that I think people don't even, I love talking about how much he is derived. Even the symbol on his chest is so rooted in Old Testament Superman, and then later he became more popular and mainstream, he became a Christian Messiah type figure, and then after that there was a lot of times that people kind of played with him as, like, we're not going to worry about basis in existing human mythology. We're going to really just take it into the extremes of the science fiction and fantasy elements much more heavily. So there's a lot of ways to approach him.
Well, you mentioned growing up reading the comics. Were you was that something you kept up with? Like, were you reading through during the 80s? Were you reading when they rebooted the continuity with John Byrne? Yeah,
sorry, I lost my headphones there for a second.
That's okay.
I just knocked them off my own head, reaching for water. I got excited. You mentioned John Byrne's Superman. Yeah, that's John Byrne's Superman is actually, and I know this is a controversial thing to say for some weird reason, but his is probably pound for pound. His run on the character and the character's mythology is probably my favorite personally in the comics. It's hard to distinguish between that and then Jeff Johns' run with the Secret Origins and the Brainiac storyline and everything. Those iterations are my favorite. And Byrne he got so deep into the world building. And I read the comics. I didn't collect Superman comics regularly the way I did Batman and Captain America and Spider-Man, which I've collected since childhood.
Yeah.
Since I was a little kid, I would save up whatever money I had and do whatever I could to obtain the newest issues of them. And I've still got boxes filled with these things. But Superman, I didn't really start collecting until John Byrne until that reboot of the character. I really liked what he did with the character. And it was a great starting point because Superman had such complexity to his mythology. And there were so many issues with, there was Superboy, but there's not. And a lot of the alternate dimension stuff that went on. It was, Batman, even, the continuity come and go. At the end of the day, Batman's parents were murdered. He fought criminals, and then he found an orphan kid and made him put on green underwear and boots and fight crime with him, and everything remained pretty much the same. But a lot of Superman's mythology changed so much. It was harder for me when I was younger to really dive in and just kind of follow. Byrne opened the door for me to come in at a starting point and just really become immersed in it. And from that point on, I on and off became a regular or semi-regular reader and collector of the comics.
Yeah, I have a similar story. I mean, for me, growing up, I loved the Christopher Reeve films. I was less enamored of the Superman comics during that era, primarily because as a kid, and this is like blasphemous to say now, but I didn't find Kurt Swan's art particularly engaging. I found it very stodgy and stuff, and I look back at it now and I have a great deal of affection for it, but at that time, that was a barrier to entry for me. So when I heard that they had rebooted the whole thing, and I found out about it through, in fact, they still publish it. It's for little kids. It's called Scholastic News. And it's just like a little thing, like a weekly newsletter that kids get in school. So they had a big old. It was the splash page at the end of Man of Steel issue 1, where you see Superman flying towards the camera. Yes. I think you can imagine that image. And it was that picture, and it was talking about the whole reboot. And I was like, "This looks amazing," And I jumped in maybe about a year in, and then I went backwards. And so basically, from '86. Through to like 2006, I never stopped buying Superman comics.
That's impressive.
Yeah,
I won't comment on the Kurt Swan thing. We'll just move past that. No,
I mean it's funny because definitely now as an adult, I have this appreciation for what he did. But being a little kid, there was just something I was like, how come that doesn't look like that? And the image that I had of Superman as sort of youthful, which was Christopher Reeve, whereas Kurt Swan, his approach to drawing, not to Superman but in general, was it was almost like the anti Kirby, where Kirby had heightened dynamism, Swan had really dialed down into this specific, like a DC kind of realism,
Yeah, I agree. I tease you about it, but there's certain artists that really and John Byrne had been one of my favorite artists and storytellers for a long time from his work in Marvel, and his Captain America run was brief, but it remains one of my favorite, and I love he and Neil Adams and certain artists that kind of were defined my fandom of these things. And Kurt Swan was definitely his Superman always looked like kind of a scolding G-man kind of character.
Right, yeah, exactly.
In a way, he looked older and like he was always very somber and serious, and like he was there to tell you to eat your vegetables and only your vegetables, not the meat.
It's true. So that to me,
I love him.
Yeah. It's so funny. I think back on because the first comic book I have a memory of, and I don't remember the issue number, but it was a Superman comic. It was called The Kid Who Played Superman, and it was this kid who's dressing up like Superman, and so it had this great cover by Gil Kane, and and this was like peak Gil Kane, where he had really, like, he had a very specific style that was just, it was all, you know, dynamism, and it was really stripped down, really exciting. And then you buy the comic off the rack, and then you take it home, and then it's a lot of Kurt Swan art. And again, I have the appreciation for it now, but I remember being like, really, like, it was kind of a buzzkill as a kid, you know. So I was like, people nowadays, there's plenty of people who critique the Man of Steel reboot as being unnecessary and it threw everything away, whatever. I'm not going to get into that because just to me, I mean, that was my entree into this, and yes. I got in, you know, I was, whatever I was, 7 or 8, at the right age for, you know, 5 years later when they did the Death of Superman story, it hit me in exactly the right way.
Yeah, I don't know why. I mean, it was weird to me how much rejection and opposition there was and pushback against Byrne's work when he clearly loved the character so much. And I know it's because he changed things. And fans, if you like something, then the idea of changing it is heresy. But you know, after all of these years, so many people still are kind of have mixed reactions or kind of look down at and are skeptical of Byrne's Superman work. And it's to this day, I mean, literally in my bedroom, I have certain comics that are on the shelf, a bookshelf, and they're bagged and boarded and everything. And that those comics are there. That his Man of Steel miniseries is right there, and I pull it off the shelf and I look at it and I reread it, and it was always a big influence. That series, I would say, those very early 30s and early 40s original Superman stories from that big hardcover book that my brothers had, and then the Superman movie, the first 2 movies with Christopher Reeve, and Byrne's Superman miniseries were probably the 3 most defining moments in my personal Superman fandom.
And so, did you stick around after Byrne left?
Yeah, I did a little. It was kind of on and off until, you know, but not Byrne. It was really what his interest in it, all of the stuff he did, and, you know, the stories with Krypton and everything that he was doing was so. And again, because it provided that entry point, so I was being introduced to a lot of things that I only had kind of, at best, a mild exposure to, or only half exposure or no exposure to from the previous comics. And so once I had that grounding, it inspired me to go back, and I could go look at those other stories and read them, and then kind of appreciate them when I was older. But yeah, I kept up through Byrne's time, and then after he left, it was kind of on and off, honestly. And then with the New 52 is when I really jumped back in and started. And since the New 52, I've pretty consistently collected, even when I don't always read them. Superman was still on my pull list, and I would still get it.
Well, and I want to circle back around to the New 52 because you mentioned having an affinity for that early social justice fighter Superman. So curious to get your take on the Grant Morrison spin on that. But before we even do that, while the reboot happens, about a year after that, we get Superman 4, and here you're in your late teens at this point. How did I mean, I'm curious because it, you know, I was let's see, the 87, so I was 7 going on 8, and I saw Superman 4 and I was like, this is not a good movie. That was me as an 8-year-old. So I'm curious where you were at as somebody who saw Superman the movie at exactly the right time, and then here we are 10 years later, and the franchise is on its last legs.
Oh, it was devastating to me. I had kind of given up at that point anyway, but it was really devastating that Superman with the first 2 movies were so good, and I loved them so much. And I had this expectation that, oh my God, now there's going to be a Batman movie, and oh, listen, they're going to do a Supergirl movie. I was thinking all of these great things, and then, of course, it was just everything went off a cliff after the second Superman movie. It really did. Basically. So the disappointment was tremendous. Even the third movie, I liked at the time, because I was a teenager, I went through the thing that I'm sure a lot of fans do, where, well, you're older, and now that you're older, you're embarrassed by any of the things that appealed to you as a kid that, as a teenager, you can look at it and be like, oh my gosh, what was I thinking? That was so.
Right.
And it's that notion that when I'm whatever age I'm at, that's what I think all the comics should appeal to me and my own narrow taste or whatever. And I had a brief period of that, luckily not too long, but from about 15 until basically when I was in high school, I wanted the more serious stuff. And so those Superman 3 and Superman 4, aside from Superman fighting himself in Superman 3, most of that stuff I was just like, oh God, this is just terrible. I just didn't like it. I came back around, at 18 and with my nieces and nephews being able to say, their fans come in all ages, and they have a right to want stuff that they can enjoy and that appeals to them. And for these movies to have a mainstream appeal and to get more of these movies made, they have to appeal to people who aren't just fans that are my age and that have my specific taste. So a little bit of humor in it, if that helps make people enjoy it. And if, I'm okay. And the older I get, the more I'm willing to embrace a wider variety of approaches to the stuff.
I think part of what you're saying, I mean, I think the older we get is a key factor there, because you realize how ephemeral this all is anyway.
Yes.
It just change is inevitable. And you and I have seen online how The Last Jedi has been sort of, talked to death over the past few months. And to me, at least, what it all comes down to is not in any way minimizing people's legitimate critiques, but I think the vast majority of the critiques are, well, this is not what I know / what I expected.
Yeah, which is, look how often that's exactly what all of it, but with fandom of anything, whether it's sports or comic books or Star Wars, whatever it is, fandom generally, the nature of being a fan is that you love a thing, and if you love something obsessively and follow it, then you probably have strong opinions about it, and you probably don't want it to deviate far from the things you personally prefer.
Yeah.
So I get where it's, the root of all of this is that people, this is not what they expected. And when our expectations are subverted in favor of something else, then there's a pretty good chance that we're going to react with some hostility toward it initially. And we're going to be, whether it's the character doesn't have the right color hair, or their muscles aren't big enough, or they're not tall enough, or they didn't cast the specific ethnicity that was from somebody's personal favorite iteration, whatever it is, right. Or it's, oh, well, they're not, I can't relate to it because it's not a white man who looks exactly like me with a background I can relate to, so it's impossible for me to relate to it. Whatever those things are, that drive certain fans away or bring other fans into the fold, it's always been that way. And I think there's just the more toxic voices have outlets now for their anger, and they're able to rant about it, and then other people that maybe share their narrow view kind of latch on and realize, hey, there's more people who have a narrow attitude like I do, and so it kind of amplifies the toxicity and the negativity, and it makes it seem louder and bigger than it maybe really is. Even though, unfortunately, I do think some of that stuff has spread a little and grown a little more common. Yeah. I still don't think it's a majority of fandom. I think most fans are more open-minded and love this stuff and aren't like that.
Well, and with that in mind, I mean, that provides a good pivot where we can look at, obviously, the current incarnation of Superman on screen in the form of Henry Cavill. And you've been in the weeds. You've been a defender of the DC cinematic expanded universe, I guess we call it. And you've been exposed to both sides of what feels a lot more heated than it needs to be. And what I mean by that is there are people who adore these movies to the point of what feels bizarre, certainly to me, and then there are people who hate them to the point where it's like, all right, just settle down.
Yeah.
And,
yeah.
And it's weird how you talk about toxic fandom. I mean, unfortunately, that phrase has become this albatross hung around the neck of fans of the DCEU.
Yeah, and they don't. I think two things are true. Number one, I'm obviously, despite people who are angry at me because I point out box office numbers that are not always favorable to some of the DC films, I have for years defended these movies and have been a big fan of them. I love Batman versus Superman possibly more than anyone who wasn't actively involved in making that film. I love the Ultimate Cut in particular, and I think it's just crazy that it's not appreciated more. And I think there will come a time years down the road when people will look back, and even if they don't love it, they'll look back and at least I feel confident that they'll look back and say, I'm not really sure why we were all so hostile to that movie. Maybe it's better than we thought, which happens with a lot of movies, get looked at with hindsight and appreciated more outside of their own time. And I do think there has been kind of a pile on sometimes by some outlets that have, because negativity sells and clickbait sells, and they know that DC fans are a little more desperate for good news and for things to work out because things haven't. So a lot of people take advantage of that. And I think there are a lot more good DC fans than there are bad ones. But I also think DC fans don't do themselves any favors because there is that corner who have become very toxic and who have become very loud. And a lot of DC fans, because they feel kind of, they feel kind of outside of the mainstream because of the reception the movies have gotten and the negativity, they are disinclined to criticize or call out fans who are engaged in toxic behavior. And so I think it's allowed the toxicity to spread and be amplified in a way that wouldn't have happened if we were better at trying to police one another and saying, look, it's okay to be upset, but you're going too far here. And, don't take everything, don't internalize it so much that you can't even see an article about a Marvel movie without immediately, case in point, when I posted my review of Black Panther, the entire thread, I twice deleted and reposted my review of Black Panther because the threads kept, and still, even the most recent time that I did, I just gave up because the threads were just the same DC fans would come back over and over and just fill the threads complaining about Marvel movies and about how it's not fair and things like that. Yeah. And I'm like, we can't even just, this is, you're doing what you are upset at you say that other people do to DC movies. That's, and so I think the DC fans become one of the things that amplifies the negativity toward DC movies because they spread the things, they increase the traffic on negative articles, they create more buzz about it. So anyone who's out there looking to drive traffic and ad revenue is going to say, oh, I know what I need to do if I want attention and a lot of people talking about my articles and a lot of clicks. I'll write negative stuff that trashes the DC movies.
Right.
It's like clockwork, and it's a cycle. And fans, I know, they just can't help themselves doing it sometimes.
It's certainly for me, of the DC movies we've gotten thus far, I say I've gone blue in the face trying to tell people this. I'm like, look, I gave Man of Steel a good review. I was fairly hard on Batman vs Superman, but I was more positive than most about Suicide Squad, and I liked Wonder Woman and Justice League. That means I am overwhelmingly a fan of these movies.
Yes, you are.
And yet I have been tagged a DCEU hater, and I still get shit from people about my Batman vs Superman review like 2 years out,
Yes.
And it's, and without fail, what you're saying is so true, because I posted my initial reaction to Black Panther, which was I really liked it, and like clockwork, if I post something positive about the MCU, I will lose followers on social media.
Yep. I lost in the past week. I gained followers because of my political tweets,
sure,
but I lost, and I can watch and I can see. And, there's ways you can track who's following you and who's not. And I see all these people whose accounts have an avatar that's a picture from DC or a DCEU movie. Just as when I post anything about Marvel and I posted my review of Black Panther, boom, boom, boom. 30 people on Twitter unfollowed me in a single week, just within a couple of days because of that kind of stuff. About between 20 and 30 people. And it's like, that's crazy.
Well, see, what's funny to me about that is when I was a kid reading comics, I was never all DC or all Marvel. I was like, I like these characters, I like these characters. And I'm like, unless you've got some kind of financial stake in any of these universes, why not just enjoy whatever you can?
Right.
I mean,
they all we benefit. I mean, there wouldn't be a DCEU if the MCU hadn't worked out. Warner would not have invested like this in trying to do it in the first place. Yeah. So, that, and the people they go back and forth, just like in the comics. This artists and writers who work at DC worked at Marvel at one point, and they will again work at Marvel. And the ones who work at Marvel worked at DC at one point, and they will. That's how it works. It's cross pollination.
What a concept. Hell, Brian Bendis is moving across town and doing a John Byrne for Superman now.
Yes, thank God. I can't wait to see that.
That should be fun.
Yeah. Did you collect besides DC and Superman comics? What you collected and read Marvel titles as well, right?
Yeah. So I mean. During the 80s, I lived in Saudi Arabia. So I moved to Saudi Arabia when I was like 3 or 4, and so over there, comics were relatively hard to find. So we would come back to the States every year, and then I'd read whatever I could. But the one comic in Saudi Arabia that was always available was G.I. Joe.
Wow.
Weirdly enough, yeah. And so I'm a huge fan of the Larry Hama run on G.I. Joe, partially because I read that religiously growing up. When I moved back to the States in the early part of the 90s, I went back and I caught up on a lot of the stuff that I only had bits and pieces from. So the stuff that I read regularly growing up was from Marvel was Amazing Spider-Man, Avengers, Captain America, Iron Man, and Thor. Those are my Marvel titles, and then on the DC,
those are good ones.
Yeah, I mean, and that was like the best era for some of that stuff. I mean, you had Captain America, Mark Gruenwald did it from the middle of the 80s through the late 90s. Avengers, you had Roger Stern, John Buscema doing it. It was just gorgeous, and it still holds up. Iron Man was, Bob Layton, David Michelinie. Like, I have just a lot of really good memories of these great runs. And what I've done since then, all these old back issues, I've totally robbed them of their value because I've bound them into custom books that I can put on my shelf. So, so I have like custom volumes. I should show you pictures of them, of Iron Man from like 1980 to like 96, and Superman from 86 to 96, from 86 to 2006. So I have 36 hardbound volumes of Superman.
Holy smokes.
Yeah. And including all like tie-ins and miniseries, like everything, you name it, and it's all included in this. And again, it's like you can't take these books to like a comic book shop and expect to get value out of them, but they look gorgeous on your shelf,
Yeah, yeah.
So, I mean, but that was me growing up. I loved them both, I mean, it was never either or. So the fact that we as fans now, it's funny, I said this on my other show. I'm like, I remember 1995, Bruce Wayne tells Dick Grayson in Batman Forever, he's like, hey, the circus is halfway to Metropolis. And I was like, holy crap, Metropolis! And like that was as close as we ever got to a shared universe in those days. So I'm like, you got a movie with friggin' Cyborg and Flash, and they're like Steppenwolf is there. Who thought we'd ever see him in a movie? It's all gravy as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, and I know there's a lot of controversy about how Justice League turned out, and it's I liked Justice League. I mean, it's flawed, but I still liked it, and I liked it I saw it several times before it released, and each time I saw it, I liked it a little more and was able to if you can let go of the issues with CGI and with the knowledge that this there was a different movie at one point existed, or some semblance of it. I will say I don't want to feed the flames of there's a secret and completed Zack Snyder cut out there, because there's not.
Right.
But I mean, he did a. I don't want to derail it. But
can you address a little bit of because this is the meme that's out there, and it's almost impervious to just sort of the realities of the industry, which is that it's not sitting in a drawer somewhere ready to go, but for Warner Brothers executives, rubbing their fingers together saying, we're gonna screw Zack Snyder over. I mean, it just that his completed version of the movie does not exist.
Right. There's not a complete. I'll say it this way. I know that he started making his director's cut version of the film, editing a first cut, rough cut of the film together around the end of the first week of January of last year. And he worked on the film, and he actually did more than one edit of the film. That is true. He did a couple of different edits of the film, and he was working on edits and changes through the end of April and into around the start of May. And of course, there was a brief time period when the tragedy with his daughter happened in March, and that disrupted things. But he was working on and off on doing an edit of the film, and then there was an assembly cut put together, and then some of the stuff was actually being completed and finished. But then they also knew that there were going to be reshoots and pickups that were already planned, but that it also needed additional reshoots that had not been planned, and then that it needed additional scenes and additional footage. And that's when, of course, Whedon was brought in and to add that stuff. So there was, even while Zack Snyder was working on, various cuts and edits to the film, there was also an awareness that, what is happening and what's being built is going to have additional stuff that has to be reshot. It has incompleted visual effects work. It's waiting on extra scenes that will be added and change the narrative around, which affects the edit of the film, because different stuff's going to be added and some stuff's going to be removed. So that anyone who thinks that there is a nearly completed, finished, polished version of a Zack Snyder director's cut out there that just needs a minor bit of tweaking to be releasable is in for a rude awakening, because that's not the case. Now, it is true there's a good amount of footage that if they wanted to take the theatrical version and then re-edit it back into what's a lot of what existed in the initial cuts and the initial edits and some of that completed stuff, they could at least probably add a good, there's probably room to release. And I don't want to feel too much speculation here on it, but I'll go ahead and say we're far enough out now that it doesn't matter anymore. There's no point in worrying about this stuff. There's probably something approaching a 2.5-hour version of that movie with enough completed footage, including what Whedon did plus Snyder, that would fit together. Yeah. Now, it wouldn't fit great. It would definitely require weeks or months in the editing room to decide what works, because a lot of the stuff, because of changes that were made, would not necessarily fit or work. But there's enough that they could probably add in 10 to 15 minutes without a problem, without disrupting the narrative, and just insert into it and say, here, you want an extended cut? Here's a 2-hour and 15-minute version. Boom. They could probably do that fairly easily. A 2.5-hour cut would be a little trickier probably, but I think it's probably workable. But it still would not. It would be a mix of Whedon's work as well as what Zack had done, and a lot of it would just also involve extending, like, that whole the history and the ancient past and the first battle on Earth with Steppenwolf and all of that. There's a lot of stuff there that was originally going to kind of open the film, and it was going to be a big spectacle type thing. So some of what we're talking about, people should remember, is just extended action and destruction sequences. Yeah. So do keep that in mind.
Do you agree with what the scuttlebutt was recently, that basically Warner's just kind of were like, you know what, let's just get this out there and get it over with and then just move on? Was there any serious attempt at making the film better, or was it just like, well, it's probably going to be a mess, so let's just put it in the rear view as fast as we can?
There's a few things to consider. I'll say this, and I know and this is also something I just have to say, you know what, I'm just going to stop worrying about being how I word things. There's a lot of truth to the fact, and I've written articles, spelling this out and saying this in no uncertain terms, that Warner Brothers, there was executive intervention and interference in some of the stuff that I think was responsible for a lot of the problems that happened. And I do think that it wasn't nefarious. I mean, it was just, they're running a business, and then after after the reaction to Batman v Superman, there was panic at high up levels. And I think there became a lot more concern about, it became difficult to separate decisions being made for the purpose of really trying to handle these IP and these properties in the best way for the properties themselves. Yeah. And there was a blurring between that kind of decision making and kind of cover your butt, save your own job, protect your golden parachute kind of stuff.
Save
going
your
on
bonus.
At the higher levels. Right. So if I had to say, I think there was a big mishandling of these IP at the top levels. Yeah. And I think it's unfortunate, and I think the decision-making, things could have been done a lot earlier and things could have worked out a lot better. I think at the end of the day, this was just the decision to take these major IP and these huge properties and to say, we're going to dump them like a piece of baggage on the side of the road and just get past them.
Yeah.
I understand, on the one hand, I understand the idea that we have a problem. We have a movie that we think is difficult. We're going to move past this anyway. It's, there's a lingering headache from the approach in Batman v Superman. So this movie, we just have to get past it. Just, set it aside, put it out there. Don't spend too much more money or time on it. But you know what? This is Superman and Batman and Wonder Woman. This is your Justice League.
Right.
You don't do that. Even if you have to delay the release date and say, you know what? We're not happy with where it's at. We have a whole lot of stuff done, but we need to do additional work on it. They should have delayed the release date till the following summer. And if they had to put an extra 50 to 100 million on top of it, even if it meant it was going to, in the short term, cut into the profit margin for that film itself because of the costs, in the long run, getting it right was a hell of a lot more important than getting it out there and getting past it. When you treat your Justice League and those IP in that manner, you can't expect it to be forgiven that you've done that. I think that is really doing a disservice to the characters, and I think it was very poor business decision making to do that. I mean, there's treating it as something to get rid of and move past instead of taking the time to make it work and to make it the best it could be. Yeah, well, I mean, look at the CGI in that, and that's the CGI is not the biggest problem with it, but it is kind of a distilled, perfect physical incarnation of the whole problem. It looked like they had somebody do it remove his mustache in 5 minutes with Photoshop on a laptop, and then they said that's good enough. They didn't care more to get it right. They could have easily delayed. Just delaying the release date to the summer would have helped the film, I think. And some of the editing decisions, the idea to just, it has to be 2 hours or less. All of those choices, none of those choices were being made for the purpose of storytelling. They were all being made to keep costs down, to let it run more often, day by day in theaters, and to jack up what money they could recoup. They saw the whole thing as trying to recoup and salvage instead of do what we have to make this a success.
Right.
And that was a real shame. The properties deserve better, and I think it was a gross mishandling of the IP. From a purely business perspective, it's an inexcusable mishandling of the IP.
And the shame of it is even if we look at the Snyder iteration of Superman as seen in Man of Steel and Batman v Superman, if we see that as a character in transition, or he's becoming the Superman that we know, certainly, Superman is now fully formed at the end of Justice League, and if that is in fact the last that we see of Henry Cavill in that role, which I hope it won't be, I mean, what a shame it would be, It pisses me off a little bit.
He deserves better.
He does.
He deserves a lot better. He should have got his second Superman movies. What should have happened is they shouldn't have killed him at the end of Batman versus Superman. He should have got, before Batman versus Superman, he should have got a solo sequel to Man of Steel. That would have been a better decision, I think. Do a movie with Brainiac or something that's a much more just... And let him be a happier, more heroic Superman character. You could still do Batman v Superman and do the deconstruction, but before you deconstruct something, you have to construct it first. And I think the films relied too much on the notion that audiences already know him and are familiar with him, so we can just go straight to deconstruction, which I get as a fan.
Yeah.
And it worked for me because I have that familiarity, but mainstream audiences want... before they're willing to settle back and say, okay, now you can kind of take this thing apart and tinker with it, they want you to establish that hero and establish the heroism and the construction of them first, I think. That's my opinion.
Well, let me ask you, I mean, putting aside your feelings about Batman v Superman as a film, but given the reaction to Man of Steel, which was fairly polarizing, was it a smart play for Warner Bros. To double down on Zack Snyder to do the follow-up as opposed to bringing in somebody new at that stage?
I think it was because I think, and this is something I always try to remind people of, the decision-making on Man of Steel. Zack Snyder was very much a director-for-hire job on Man of Steel. That project was already completed. It had Christopher Nolan and David Goyer had created the story. Goyer had written it. They had their whole plan for it, and the studio was not going to let Zack Snyder come in and change anything. Specifically, Zack Snyder was able to get one concession and one agreed change to the entire film that he had to fight for, and had to bring Goyer and convince Goyer and get Goyer to help him convince Christopher Nolan to approve Zack Snyder's decision. He wanted Superman to kill Zod at the end, and he said, we need to establish this as
a completely non-controversial decision that nobody mentioned.
Yeah, which I did. I have criticisms of Man of Steel, but to me personally, that was not one of them. I was like, well, that's it. Had Superman killed in the comics, despite what Dan Slott or any other lunatics want to say. Yeah. He did in the past do it. It doesn't mean that he should always do it, but having him fight an indestructible villain who makes it clear, we're going to fight until one of us dies because I'm going to kill as many people as I can until you stop me. Superman. It was beyond just that the context of that singular moment. It was even if you stop him from using his vision on those people and killing that family, this fight's going to go on. And even if you knock him out, he's going to wake up. Where are you going to put him? What are you going to do? And Superman, in desperation, kills Zod and then vows not to kill again. And I think that's a valid choice. I understand why it bothered some people, but at the end of the day, I don't think that's what hurt the movie. No. I think the lack of joy of showing Superman have more joy, and the fact that his father was like, next time there's a bus of children, just let them die, Clark. Those things, I think, were more polarizing for audiences and for fans. Well, and that was not Zack Snyder's choice. He, if anything, went more toward the fantasy and comic book elements with his own approach. So I would have given him. I think the problem was that the decisions about how to approach Batman versus Superman and to hurry and to use it They wanted the Superman's death. They wanted to do Death of Superman. They wanted to bring Batman in quickly. They wanted to bring Wonder Woman in quickly, and they wanted to hurry and get to Justice League. That was the problem, I think. I don't think the problem at all was Zack Snyder coming aboard. I think Snyder did and still does. I think he is great with these films, and I think he's a great filmmaker. I just think the studio's desire to move more quickly required certain choices and story elements like Superman dying and so on that were probably more problematic. And at the point that they, well, I won't get into that, but yeah, that I don't think. I think going with Snyder. I was a proponent of Snyder at the time, and in the aftermath of Man of Steel, I freely admit I was one of the people who said you need to let Zack Snyder sit down with a bunch of people and come up with a plan, develop a whole DC universe, and then put different filmmakers on different projects, but let him be a guiding force of how to develop a big screen DCU.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting. First of all, I'm a fan of Man of Steel, but one critique that I have had of that film is in addition to the stuff that you mentioned, what I found indulgent, I would say, is just the sort of destruction porn that we see in both the Smallville battle and then the Metropolis battle at the end, where it just it struck me as like that's how you end movie 3, not movie 1. It's like sensory overload,
Yeah, and it was it was a clear reaction to the complaints about Superman Returns not being action driven.
It was an overreaction in the opposite direction.
They had that, plus they had the obsession, and I love Goyer and Christopher Nolan's work, I'm a fan of Man of Steel, but I think the obsessive notion of, but let's make it realistic, let's make it grounded in realism, let's explain everything. There was such attention to that, and because it worked, grounded in realism worked in Batman, so let's do it. If 10 degrees of realism is good, then 20 degrees must be great, so 200% increase must be the best. So they went that way, and so the idea of what would it really... I think there's value in saying, okay, if Superman's going to fight another Kryptonian, let's show the destruction it causes is fine, but they went so far, they kind of, I think, got excited by it, and it went on too long, as you said, and Superman, we didn't see enough reaction from him to trying to actively prevent the destruction and save people. There were moments, Superman, when he first tackles, the first time he gets, in a fist fight with Zod, he tackles him when Zod is threatening his mother.
Right.
And he's punching Zod. He drags him through a gas station and blows the entire gas station up. We don't even know if there were people in it.
That's
there were, Superman literally personally killed those people.
They were ex-people now, yeah.
Yeah, there's no getting around it. Anybody in that store was dead. And then the grain silos blowing up. So much of the destruction that happens that he seems... There's a scene where Zod throws a gas truck at him. Superman floats up in the air over it to dodge it. It hits a building behind him, explodes. The building catches fire and collapses. Superman literally glances over his shoulder at it and then looks away. That's interesting.
Yeah.
And I was like, why does he not care that people are... There could be... He's not even, and if he... Okay, well, maybe he used his supervision and saw no one was in it. Okay, maybe he did, but they sure as hell didn't show that.
Yeah.
So come on, just a little bit goes a long way. Showing him a little bit. The most concern he seems to have, he saves the soldiers when there's, that soldier is in danger and the helicopter and is falling out, and in the Smallville scene, and he tells somebody, get inside, it's not safe. And that's about it.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I think as we sort of wind down here, we've covered all the different ways that Superman has been depicted. When you sum up the 80-year history of this character, what does Superman mean to you? And I think you've alluded to it to some extent throughout our hour, but 8 decades. What is it about this character that makes him not only resonate, but what makes him important?
Superman, I think what's important about Superman is that the idea that doing the right thing and using he has the power to do good and to try to change the world, and he wants to do that, and he wants to do it responsibly, and he's not, there's a lot of talk about whether Superman is corny or whether, well, Captain America's corny too, isn't he?
Yeah.
He's a Boy Scout too, but he also is one of the most popular cinematic superhero characters in the world now. And Superman is kind of this ultimate immigrant story. As a lot of people will say, it's the story of someone who comes from somewhere else, who is escaping death or persecution, comes here and loves and is able to look at this country and this world and say there are flaws and there are problems and there are tragedies, but those things, we can let those things define us, or we can rise above it and resist them and do so without concern about whether or not people think we're corny, or whether or not people understand always why we're so driven to do these things, and why does social justice matter to us? Well, because when you have power, with power should come compassion, and should come understanding, and should come mercy. And I think that's, Superman takes joy in doing the right thing. And we live in such a cynical world that tries to make us feel embarrassed by a person who likes doing good. And instead we like the anti-hero. So often people act like the word hero is only worthwhile if it has the word anti in front of it. And I get why anti-heroes are interesting, but Superman is a good person, and he's not ashamed of being a good person, and he's not ashamed of telling other people, you should be a good person too. You'll be happier and you'll make other people happy, and that's worthwhile. And he didn't like bullies. And it's common now. People like to say even people that are bullies will literally accuse other people. Nazis will accuse people of bullying them on the internet. And it's absurd and it's outrageous and it's a misuse of it. But Superman really dislikes bullies. And from his very first comics, he went around saying, if you're a bully, then I'm going to stop you, period. Stop you dead in your tracks. Sometimes he'd throw you like a javelin into the forest miles away just to stop you from being a bully. So that Superman was important to me in that way. And Superman the movie, all these years later, 40 years later, it was the first superhero movie, and it got it so right that it still, to this day, is the template for superhero origin stories.
And so true.
Wonder Woman, Thor, Captain America, they all took great – Batman Begins even Christopher Nolan's hyper-realistic Batman Begins, looking for inspiration on how to do an origin story, looked back to the first movie, Superman the movie, 1978. And that's a testament to how great that film was, and how great Christopher Reeve's performance was, and how important the movie is in the history of cinema and for superheroes in general.
Man, that's just a perfect summation. Now, I had asked you earlier, and I might want to make sure we do follow up, the Grant Morrison New 52 take on Superman. Very curious what your thoughts were on that.
Oh, I loved his Action Comics. It was such a return to it was weird and wild. And, I loved, a lot of people were like, this is way too weird. But that's an example of, Superman Grant Morrison is so good at being able to honor the entire legacy of these characters. He doesn't think anything needs to be thrown away. He did it with Batman, of course, even some of the more absurd, crazy, even Batmite. Grant Morrison made Batmite work in modern Batman comic books, and he did that with his Superman run. It was weird and crazy, and it was very bold, and I really appreciated it. And it was actually my personal for me, so that and I know I'm going to catch flack for saying this from a lot of Superman fans, but Grant Morrison's Action Comics run and Superman Unchained were probably my two favorite iterations of Superman in the New 52, and then of course the Justice League, Jeff Johns' Justice League as well. And then some of the more recent Superman stuff I've liked as well. Don't get me wrong, but as far as the New 52 stuff, that Grant Morrison Action Comics run. I really, really dug it.
As tends to often be the case, I'm pretty much exactly on the same page with Mark on that one. Both the Morrison run and then also the Superman Unchained that Jim Lee drew. That was I was not a huge fan of the New 52 era, but I did enjoy both of those storylines quite a bit.
Something that's worth mentioning about Superman the movie. Its box office, adjusted for inflation, Superman the movie, when you think about it, was made when there were far less theaters, especially overseas. In some markets, essentially, there was basically no China movie market back then. A lot of the major markets and the number of theaters worldwide were much, much lower, and yet, adjusted for inflation in today's dollars, Superman the movie made about as much as Captain America: Civil War. The value of its box office is over $1 billion because it made $300 million, and that's, by today's standards, $300 million doesn't sound like all that much, but
yeah.
For the time, it really did great, and I think it's one of the top 20 all-time, adjusted for inflation, one of the all-time highest-grossing films.
And that tells you something not only about how well it did what it set out to do, but the fact that here we are with, in any given year, you're looking at between 8 and 12 big-budget superhero movies, and all of these are the great-grandchildren of what Richard Donner accomplished 40 years ago with Superman the movie.
Yeah, I still love it, and I hope that someday... I hope whatever happens, I hope Henry Cavill sticks around. I kind of suspect that we're going to find out one way or the other, and maybe hear something about him being on the set of Shazam, maybe, or something. Right. I don't know, but I keep thinking that's going to happen. But I hope, I would love to see a Superman movie. Be it a sequel to the current DCEU, or whether it's a reboot, whatever it is, a Superman movie that looks back at Superman the movie and some of the classic great iterations of this character and brings that to life. And of course, I've advocated for adapt Jeff Johns' Brainiac to the big screen and let Patty Jenkins, for example, direct it.
I'd
do
pay to
something
see that.
Yeah, it would be. There's so much that could be done, and so much promise there. So I really hope that whatever happens, I'm hopeful, even though I'm also lately Warner Brothers has kind of made me skeptical.
Well, it is with hope that we will leave this conversation, because Superman is all about inspiring hope and representing hope. And I'm hopeful that my guest, Mark Hughes, will come back and choose another topic to discuss with us. Mark, I had an absolute blast hanging out with you over the past hour. And like I said before we started recording, we've interacted plenty of times online and both on Facebook and Twitter. But just to sort of shoot the shit with you has been just an absolute blast, and I thank you for taking the time to do that.
Yeah, I thank you for having me on the show, and it's something that I wish we'd done sooner, and I definitely think we should do again. There's a lot of anniversaries coming up.
That's right.
This is Dark Knight. It's the Dark Knight anniversary this year, so we've got that, and I'm sure there's going to be a lot of news coming up. I think we'll have Superman news sometime this year as far as the movies go. So definitely anytime you have an open chair, let me know. I'm happy to come on and talk, and it's always a great time.
That'll be great. And where can people find you online? You are easy to reach, but you're in plenty of forums, so where can people see you?
You can find me on Twitter at Mark Hughes Films. You can read my reviews and my articles at Forbes, where I'm a contributing writer. And you can find me as the co-host with Sean Gerber at Superhero News Channel on YouTube, and Sabrina Graves. We're all there at Superhero News talking about
and you
all
do
this stuff all the time.
your video reviews fairly often.
Yes, yeah, we do. For Superhero News, we do we do weekly shows, and we review all the big superhero movies and genre films, and always do updates on whatever the big news of the day is and the big news of the week.
Well, there we go. And with that, you can find me on Twitter at Zacky's Corner. That's ZAKIS Corner. And just add a .com to that. You can go to my website where you can find my movie reviews as well as this show, as well as the regular movie film show, and any other podcast appearances I do. If you like what we are doing on this show and the movie film show, please go to iTunes and leave a review. Leave a star rating. Every little bit helps. And if you have any feedback you would like to offer, please email moviefilmpodcast@gmail.com and hit like on our Facebook page, facebook.com/moviefilmpodcast. On behalf of my guest, Mark Hughes, my name is Zaki Hassan. This has been Nostalgia Theater, celebrating 80 years of Superman. We'll be back soon with our next episode. Thanks, everybody, for listening.